I'm going to talk about a project I did as a freelancer about a year ago. This was a casual game called WORDLINGS, which was a word game, actually 4 games in one. And it's like anything from like simple anagrams to like more complicated, like almost like crossword puzzle style games. And they also had an online multiplayer component to them, and as well as like a cooperative LAN version where if you were on the same Wi-Fi network, you could play cooperative word games together. Just quick about my background. Here are some of the places I've worked at. And yes, Amazon, I actually had that logo while I was there. And some of the properties that I've worked on. I have a music background and sort of was self-taught with sound design. And I also have a computer science background as well. So I used to do software development for Amazon, and then I switched to media composition and scored a bunch of films, and then I got into game audio and started scoring games and doing sound design for them. The next thing is, so let's talk about WORDLINGS. So here's kind of some early comps of what I saw, what the game was going to look like. The biggest thing are there on the left are these little wordlings. They're like little creatures or icons that you get that are like little power-ups. So things like if you earn them by playing the game and doing well, and when you get them, then you can use them. They might give you clues. They might give you like double score for every vowel sound or for every vowel that you use, or double score for, using a cue or something like that. There's about 50 of these little wordlings, and the idea was that you collect them, and they had some sort of, it's free to play, but sort of a freemium model where, maybe you spend a little money and get some points and get some of these wordlings. So that was the idea for the game. And some, like the design goals for the game were, it should be engaging, it should be exciting. There's a timed mode to some of these word games, so it feels less like a puzzle game, and it's more of a, like, you've got to get this done quickly, sort of. So they wanted a little bit more drive than your typical puzzle game. They also wanted each of these wordlings to have a very distinct and lifelike personality. And also, you can see like the sort of very flat visual aesthetic, very simple color scheme, limited color palette, and everything's flat, two-dimensional. There's no bevels or any three-dimensional component to it at all. So the developer was smashing ideas, and they're sort of a website company and a UX company and a digital media or digital advertising company first, and sort of a game studio second. So they really wanted to show off their sort of like, hey, we can keep up with Apple's flat design aesthetic and make it into a cool game. So that was their play. And then we wanted to support the sort of the anthropomorphic vibe of these wordlings. However, that came up with some challenges because you've got these very flat, sort of iconic little creatures that they don't even look like a creature really, right? They're just like little icons, really. But they want them to have a sort of personality, and you can see they kind of do. But there was no real, like, they didn't have enough budget for like lots of animations or anything like that. So they were going to lean really heavily on sound to achieve that. And so the other problem, I guess, the other challenge was like, we want these to sound lifelike and exciting and unique, but at the same time, it's like they're very abstract creatures. They might not even be creatures. Are they robots? We're not really sure. So it's like they should sound synthetic yet organic, which I'm sure we've all heard many times. So yeah, creature-like. When I was talking with the design team, they talked about being inspired by birds when they created these, and that was sort of the model that they went with. So we started talking about birdsong. And but they wanted it more synthetic. They just didn't want recordings of birdsong. So they said, well, maybe you can process birdsong in some way, or maybe you can do something like that. And my solution was to actually imitate birdsong with synthesizers. So I want to back up for just a second, talk about like in pop culture, in music in general and sound design, there's lots of times that we draw from nature, and there's very good reasons for that. Our ears are trained, like all however many millions of years of evolution have trained us to think about, like if we hear a creature, our brain responds in a much more emotional way than if we just hear like, two rocks banging together or something. And there's good like evolutionary reasons for that. So I think as composers and as sound designers, we can make use of that ability so that when we imitate nature, it's going to connect with the listener, with the game player in a perhaps more deeper and more emotional way. So I'm going to give some examples, my favorite examples from pop culture. So Coyotes. Morricone decided to draw from the creatures in the natural environment where the story, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, takes place. So you hear lots of desert animals, coyotes, owls, other creatures of the desert. So that's where that came from, which I had no idea prior to reading about that. I was like, where on earth did he ever come up with such a crazy melody? Well, it turns out it was from nature. So the next example is...
And now, the creators of Ice Age present a sneak peek into the world of Rio.
That's from the animated feature Rio. And the thing I love about this is that they're using the bird song, all of those instruments that are in sambas, not all of them, but most of the instruments used in samba, especially the traditional indigenous instruments, were originally imitating bird song. Having the birds doing the samba, I thought was really cool. And it's like no coincidence that they did that. They did a lot of careful research. Sergio Mendes was actually like the musical consultant on the thing. This piece was like, it's like giants wrote this piece. As Carlinhos Brown, John Powell, of course the composer, Sergio Mendes, and Seda Garrett, who are all like, John Powell is huge in Hollywood, but the rest of them are just like who's who of like great Brazilian pop artists. Then the final example I'm going to show you is this. And I've had this theory that like Ben Burtt used bird call as like an inspiration for R2-D2, but I've never been able to prove it. And if you Google Ben Burtt bird song R2-D2, like you get something totally different, which is also cool, but not exactly what we want. Anyways, so I've never been able to prove that he actually, in fact, used birdsong as an inspiration, but I think it's probably safe to assume that. So my approach, let's talk about that. I took recordings of birdsong, and I didn't have time to go out and record them. And at the time I was living in LA during the summer, and there's just not a lot of birds in the desert in the middle of like when it's like 110 degrees out. So I used a library, and it didn't have to be a great library, but I just happened to use, what's his name? Square Inch of Silence guy, Gordon Gordon Hempton, his library. So I took those, slowed them down, pitched them down, and then I transcribed them by hand. I didn't use any audio to MIDI stuff, and I just did that because I'm good at transcribing stuff and it's fun. And then I also put it in 19-tone equal temperament, which for you non-musicians, if you take the musical scale normally is divided. The octave is normally divided into 12 different tones that are equally spaced apart. If you divide it into 19 tones instead, then you end up with 19-tone equal temperament. And it's a lot of composers like it because the different intervals sound very pleasant. They're very close to just tuning, so they line up with the overtone series really well. And then the other reason people really like to use it is because you can use traditional music notation to notate it, and the only thing you have to change is, sharps and flats become different notes. So C sharp and D flat are now different notes that are a third tone apart. So then I would speed back up these MIDI performances, to play them on a software synth, speed them back up and transpose to where they sounded good. And then I chopped them up into short phrases, and that became a big giant library. And then the developer and I went through and basically just picked. It's like, okay, for this wordling, what do you think he would sound like? Well, let's try some. Oh, this one sounds cool. Let's line them up with that. So that was the process. There was also, I did music on the project, and it happened to be in 19-tone equal temperament as well. And that was just, I don't know why, I just thought, well, I don't know if 12-tone and 19-tone are going to line up in a pleasing way, so let's just make everything 19-tone. And it was cool. And as I was transcribing, my writing partner, studio partner there, was very interested in where all these bird sounds were coming from. So I actually did take that picture during the project. So let me just do a quick demonstration, and then you can ask some questions. So here is a short sample of a prairie meadowlark, and then slowed down. And then here's my transcription slowed down. And that is just using Reactor. It's kind of a sine wave patch. And it's actually doing it live in Reaper right now, so you can... So that's sped up. And then here's like the actual section that I used. That became like a little, UI sounder. In this case, it was the sound of like, this. Anytime you activated this word lane, he would make that noise. So just a quick comparison. And that is Here are the two played together. The next one is a wren, and this wren had a ton to say. Here it is slowed down. That was that, and then I'll play my take on that. And you can hear they line up pretty well. The other thing you can do is, use a different, so this is more of a sawtoothy or kind of thing. And that gave us further source material from which to draw, one of the goals was to make these things as distinct as possible. So that's an easy way to do it. Transposing, changing pitch. Here's back at the original tempo. So as you can see, just that 8 seconds of wren Burtt call gave me tons and tons of source material. So I've got a minute left, so I'm just going to let you hear a little bit of some gameplay footage here. You can see how, even though I'm using microtonal music, it sounds pretty tonal, I mean, it's a little weird, but it's surprisingly, you can make it sound surprisingly normal. They were my former employer, so that's how I met them. They were a Flash. They were like a Flash developer, and I was a victim of the move away from Flash, as were all the animators there. So they sort of refocused more on mobile, but they didn't move quite fast enough. So, but they've been a great client ever since. So that's how I got connected with them, is they came to me and said, "Hey, we've got this game idea. We'd love for you to do music and sound." At the time, I was remote, although I did fly up here. I was in LA. They're here in Seattle. I flew up for one meeting with them. We did we talked through all the ideas. I saw those visual comps that I showed you in the third slide. They might even, I think they had a playable prototype at the time. So we played through it, and I captured some gameplay footage at the time, so that I had something to work with at home, and also to show. A lot of times when you send comps off to designers to say, okay, how does this sound? It's nice to give them some context. So they're not just listening to the sound and imagining how that would go in the game. If I actually line it up as if it were in the game and they actually are watching gameplay footage and they can hear the music and the sound design, then it's much easier for them to envision how it's going to work. So that was a lot of the process. And the birdsong idea was just brainstorming. We just sat in a meeting, and I was asking him, what are some of the inspirations that you had for coming up with these little characters? And and one of the illustrators said, we talked about them being birds, how each bird has its own sort of personality and its own coloring, but they're all birds. So that's how they thought about them. And then we're like, oh, bird song, that'd be cool. Like, how could we do that? And I think it was the plane ride home. I thought, I should try transcribing the bird song and then converting it into MIDI and then see how that works. And it worked out pretty great. And part of the inspiration actually was these, for me, was like the examples I played for you. I was thinking about Morricone and thinking about, when I got back, before I even started working, I sent that stuff to the design team and I said, hey, what about like in the same way Morricone imitates the coyote call in his crazy good, bad, and ugly theme? Like, what if we did something like that with, but with birdsong instead? And they were like, yeah, that sounds so cool. And, it was definitely a cool idea on paper, and we were lucky enough that it actually worked when we tried it for real. Certainly for me, I engaged with that in a different way because I actually had to sit and figure it out and then perform it. It just internalizes it in a different way. And I think that helps me, like those types of things help you internalize your project a little bit more. And then you can come at it from a bit deeper level. I think stuff like that's very valuable. By the way, none of it was like on the grid. It was just like the click was off and I just was taking little sections and being like, okay, da-da-da, da-da-da, and then I'd figure out what the pitches were and then play it. So yeah, it's great. And also like, just as a general thing, like rhythm is more important than pitch in any of this. Really, rhythm and sort of general shape of the pitch. I mean, the fact that I got it pretty close to in tune with the bird is sort of beside the point. It's the rhythm, and that's what really engages our speech center in our brain, and that really like just psychoacoustically, that's what like that's the emotional connection is the rhythm. Yeah, this phrasing. Yeah, and in general, right, the best musical themes tend to be rhythmic in nature. When you do 19 tone, the octave in a fifth becomes your new octave. So middle C to like a G, an octave and a half above that is like an octave. Yeah, and that's the other interesting thing about 19 tone, if like for the composers out there, like you should play around with it. It's really fun because it's like it breaks that sort of muscle memory thing of like, oh, I'm going to play what I know how to play, because it breaks your ear thing of what like, okay, I know a minor third is this far down on the keyboard. If you're a pianist by nature, like it's like all of a sudden all of that is broken, and you sort of have to relearn how to do music. So I don't know if you can see this, but tuning, there's a drop down, at least for Reactor. There's a drop down. It says octave/19. So that's literally all I did, and then everything else just worked. Thanks, everyone.